Estamos ao vivo.
Great. We are live now at the YouTube channel. Bom dia a todos que nos escutam do Brasil. Boa tarde a todos que nos escutam da Europa. Essa é uma atividade promovida pelo Programa de Pós-Graduação em Economia e Desenvolvimento da Universidade Federal de Santa Maria. Estamos inaugurando uma série de atividades a serem comunicadas pelo canal do YouTube do programa, com a finalidade de comunicar e socializar as diferentes ações que são promovidas pelo nosso curso, e também em um esforço de extensão, de socialização dos conhecimentos que são aqui produzidos e replicados. Então, a atividade de hoje conta com a participação especial do professor Abid Mehmood, da Universidade de Cardiff, numa ação que vai ser mediada pela professora Rita Pauli, em uma das ações aí importantes que o nosso programa vem desenvolvendo em esforços de internacionalização. Então, nós iniciamos esse segundo semestre letivo de 2023 com essa aula magna, e por isso a gente gostaria de agradecer a todos e a todas que estão participando dessa atividade, desejar boas-vindas aos alunos e alunas ingressantes nesse segundo semestre, e também desejar a todos os outros discentes e professores que tenham um semestre muito produtivo e que seja mais um período aí de integração e de crescimento para todos nós, ok? Eu vou, para que fique registrado, né, fazer essa primeira apresentação dos nossos participantes do evento de hoje, tá? E depois, logo em seguida, a gente passa às atividades de fato, tá? So, great, we are live now at the YouTube channel. We are in a stream yard room with students and professors of Master Program in Economics and Development of the Federal University of Santa Maria are assisting us at the YouTube channel. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I am the head of the master program of our university, and welcome to the inaugural lecture of this academic semester. We will debate about social innovation as a transformative endeavor with the special participation of Professor Abid Mehmood of Cardiff University and Professor Rita Pauli of our graduate program. We are pleased to announce that Professor Abid here with us in this morning in Brazil, and we are having here an open class as a part of one of the many activities that the Master Program in Economics and Development of the Federal University of Santa Maria are realized. I'm just starting this streaming to introduce Professor Mehmood, and Professor Rita will mediate the debate. Professor Abid has a large research about social innovation for sustainable and development, environment governance. So he has research experience in climate change, energy transition, local development, planning, policy, and practice. Professor Abid is member of the Center for Innovation Policy Research of Cardiff University and leader of the Cities and Sustainable Places Research Group. He has published in many journals, include the Discover Sustainability, European Planning Study, Sustainable Science, and others journals. Thank you for your presence here today to give us your ideas and insights on such an important, relevant topic for development studies. So I would like to thank you all the people that are with us today, and even the people that will see in the conversation through the YouTube channel in the future. So now I give the floor for Professor Rita to make other remarks as to mediate this debate. Professora Rita.
Obrigada, Cibele. Então, bom dia a todos. Thank you, Abid, to be here between us today, and probably we want to continue with this kind of experience. This may be really important, and I will do it in Portuguese a bit because the majority of the students that are now here, they are in Portuguese. So in 1 minute we can change. We can start your presentation. Sou alunos e colegas professores, então, como disse a professora Cibele, né, então, inovação social é, sem dúvida, o campo principal que o professor Abid trabalha, né, e principalmente com estudos locais e regionais, né. Então, ele sem dúvida, trabalha com planejamento e geografia, né, esse é da Cardiff University, né. Então, há muito tempo ele vem trabalhando lá, mas ele faz vários estudos locais também em outros países, estudou um tempo na França e fez estudos em Bruxelas, em Londres, mas os principais, sem dúvida, lá no país de Gales, efetivamente. Então, são estudos importantes, obviamente que a gente sabe que não existe uma possibilidade de replicar todos os estudos que são feitos em contextos diferentes, isso tudo é respeitado. Trabalha também bastante com a questão, com o problema global, com o problema do aquecimento global. Então, o foco efetivo de análise deste grande professor é justamente vincular a inovação social ao problema ambiental. Então, eu acho que, nesse sentido, nós vamos ter, sem dúvida, aqui uma experiência importante hoje. Então, rapidamente, ainda falar aqui outras temáticas com que ele trabalha, né? Governança ambiental, né? Que é um tema importante. Trabalha sobre resiliência, desastres, planejamento, política e prática de desenvolvimento, então, local e regional. Então, Abid, so you have, as we agreed, you have around 1 hour or maybe a little more or a little less. It is up to you, and it's really a pleasure to have you between us today, and you can start. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Pauli. It's a real pleasure for me, and it's a unique experience as well to present to your students. And by looking at the program, I'm really excited, and I think a lot of what you are covering in the program is incidentally, it matches my own interest. So I'm really excited to share whatever research I have to share in terms of social innovation, sustainability, governance, its implications. So I'm really looking forward to it. So I think I will be sharing slides. So I hope slides will be visible separately. So if we look at the first slide, because I'm not sharing from my computer, so I'll have to instruct slide by slide. So initially, this idea of social innovation as a transformative endeavor, it comes from my past research, but also ongoing work in different fields. And the idea is to discuss, but also share with you some concepts, some definitions of social innovation, and how its conceptual, theoretical, but also practical implications, they can shape the future, and how the concept has evolved over time. So if we can go to the slides.
Professora Cibele, the slides.
Just a minute.
Okay, I'll wait.
Yeah.
I know technology can be very challenging at times. Thank you. Okay, so this is the title, of the talk. And now if we move on to the second slide, which shows you more of an outline of what I want to discuss, what we are going to cover. So in the second slide, there's a list. If you can move on to the second slide. Yes, okay. So this is the outline of what I want to cover. Initially, I will start with more of a historical context because it is the first lecture, I understand, of the module. So it is important to discuss some basics of social innovation. Where has the idea or the concept come from? What were its roots in the history? So I will take you through the history. We will jump in and out of the history. I will not take a linear approach to history, starting from Deva and then how it has evolved, but we will discover history from point to point, from time to time. Then I will also discuss with you more contemporary views, some definitions of social innovations, and how many definitions of social innovation exist today. As it happens, if any concept or theory or idea becomes popular, has potential implications in policy and planning, it tends to be used in different ways by different people, by different policy makers, by different academics as well. So I will also discuss some of the definitions and their contexts with you. Then we will go through some of the institutional dynamics of social innovation, how it has been applied by different institutions in different ways in policy contexts. Then I will discuss some of the research which I have done, but also other people have done, and what are the potential and possible implications of the research of social innovation. And if possible, if time allows, I will take you through some of the examples at different scales, conceptual, but also more wider national and more local level implications as well. And finally, we will discuss some of the potential future research possibilities and avenues in social innovation. Now, if we move on to the next slide, so it gives you a very generalized view of social innovation. And so while the slide is coming up, I can just discuss that the whole concept of social innovation in its much more contemporary shape has evolved over time. It exists in many forms, in many shapes, in different countries, in different contexts. Of course, language also plays a role. For example, my inability to speak Spanish or Portuguese means that I have to converse in English. But in English, I am also constrained by the vocabulary which English can provide me, which may be limited or maybe more as compared with other languages. Similarly, in the context of different national policies, there are different interpretations of social innovation. And this we will discuss later on. One of the very interesting examples of social innovation is what the President Barack Obama, he applied during his term in the White House. So in the White House, he established an Office of Social Innovation and Civic Participation. And main idea was to provide funding to startups, new enterprises, promote investment into new businesses, new ideas, which have strong social context or social implications. So this is one of the examples of how social innovation can be taken on board at the highest of the policy levels. Within itself, social innovation as a concept has also evolved, and then we will look at it later. We will also look at how it has been used in different policy contexts. So national context is very important when looking at the definitions and implications and the policies of social innovation. And it is also important to see how social innovation is shaping the contemporary research policy and practice. So if we move on to the next slide, the next slide will show you more of my own personal view of what I'm going to cover. So today I'm going to cover social innovation from a place-based view. And a place-based view is very important, and it is very important for us to understand why we are using place-based view. First of all, there is the importance of place and the difference between this conception of place. Is it merely a geographical point, or is it more of a larger meaning of place? How different it is from the conception of space, for example. For example, space does not have any temporal dimension. It is much more open, especially in planning and academia. For the place, I'm taking the definition of place as a position or an area, for example, a town or a village, a city, a building, or a country, which has some specific context, some physical, tangible presence. This presence could be in the social form, in the cultural, but also environmental form. Similarly, place-based forms of social innovation can create conditions for sustainable transformations. What do we mean by transformations here? Is that transformations are about change or substantial change, and these change can occur in the form or maybe in the nature of appearance or in different ways. So social innovation has a strong potential for, or what we call transformative potential, to bringing in transformations, but in a more sustainable way, not temporary or not very specific, limited way. Again, why we are using place-based view is that this whole conceptualization of place also allows us looking at the role of people in making and shaping, keeping places. So how people can shape their own spaces. This is what social innovation is about. But it's also important to notice that places also can impact us. The places can also shape our attitudes, our behaviors, the way our cultures evolve, the way societies act. So we should not undermine the value of place itself, or the role of place on shaping our own attitudes. And finally, places can also be used as sites of incubation, spatial networking. They can inspire new social initiatives. They can inspire new innovations. So places can be very specific. They can be very general. But we'll discover further in the next slides. So if we move on to the next slide. Here, I'll try to introduce some context of why we are talking about social innovation. Why do we need to continue or do research in social innovation? And why are we talking about the possibilities or potentials of social innovation? So first of all, the whole objective of social innovation, according in my view, is to tackle the wicked problems. So what are the wicked problems? It is a very interesting terminology, especially in research and academia. A wicked problem can be defined in different ways, but in more simplistic way, we can say that it is a problem whose solution requires a lot of effort, a lot of contribution from different people, from different mindsets, from different disciplines, but also different behavioral approaches. So what happens when we define a problem as wicked, when it becomes very difficult or almost impossible to solve a problem, then it becomes a wicked problem. A wicked problem also has other qualities or other attributes, is that the problem cannot be defined clearly. There is no single definition of this problem. And even if we try to define it, the definition or the concept, the context of the problem keeps changing from time to time. So there is no one single definition which will be always valid. Just like in physics, there are very specific laws of motion, So these are defined universal laws, but for wicked problem, it is very difficult to define give any specific definition. It is also very difficult to recognize those problems. So these could be crucial problems, or still for some other from some other people, these may not necessarily be problems. A very good example of a wicked problem is climate change. So we know all the discussions around climate change, that for some people it is happening. For some people, they just plainly deny the climate change. And there are many efforts going on in resolving or addressing the challenges which are associated with climate change. But again, year on year we see there are more concerns and more examples of climate change. Again, from the social innovation perspective, we can see if we look at much a problem solution approach, that's it's the main purpose from its emergence has been one of those key purposes has been to combat the poverty, reduce poverty, especially in Europe since the 70s, but also to address social exclusion, also address the challenges of the deprivation among the communities, address the crises, the conflicts, and much more recently, conflicts and disasters as well. In many cases, the natural disasters. What role can social innovation play in helping communities address or resolve the challenges associated with, for example, natural disasters? Social innovation also offers a bridge between development agendas, so it can connect different disciplines, different development objectives. Social innovation can help in building communities, more social sense of communities. Social innovation can also be applied at different scales or multiple scales, and it has proven to be a mobilizing factors, especially in terms of socio-political debates, and that we will discover further on as well. It is also quite embedded in the action and reflection-based research. So I've given example of assets-based community development, or ABCD, in which the idea is to exploit or take advantage, positively exploit or take advantage of the assets of a communities. These assets could be tangible assets, for example, resources, natural resources. These could be intangible assets, for example, the knowledge, the historical context, the traditions, the norms, the cultures of especially of the indigenous communities. Social innovation also provides much more transdisciplinarity in terms of interaction between actors, between stakeholders. It also allows much more scientific reflection as well, especially between theory and practice. It also helps with joint problematization and shared worldview, and how we will discover that further on as well. So right now, these are some key points justifying the need for social innovation and need for further research and discussion in social innovation. So now we move on to the next slide. And here I will try to explain give some background. So we will start from the very basics, very beginning. So what do we mean by innovation? So whilst we are talking about social innovation, what does innovation imply? So innovation is different from invention. Invention. So I didn't need to give you any Latin description, because I'm already using a Germanic language to communicate, and I'm sure your Latin context and knowledge is much better than me. So the idea of innovation is that it is not about creating something new. Innovation is about improving something which is already existing. So invention is much more about creating or designing something which has not existed before. On the other hand, innovation is about making changes in something which is established, especially by introducing new methods, new ideas, or, for example, new products. So if we look further at innovation, we also see that in terms of social innovation or innovation itself, it has predominantly being considered synonymous to technological innovation. So whenever we use, generally, even today, if we use the word innovation, it will most probably mean new technology or new way of doing things, mobile technologies, high tech, AI, all these kind of things. But this definition or this perception, this meaning of innovation started changing since the 70s, from the 80s. So from the 80s, we see that innovation being translated into much more economic aspects, new economic policies, new economic initiatives since the 80s, especially social innovation as well. So we also see that the technology and business enterprise, they have, in the economic meaning of innovation, they were considered to become much more the key drivers of development, especially from the 70s and 80s. So the new technologies, new entrepreneurship initiatives have been considered as the drivers of change, drivers of growth. And we also see that more occurrence of investment into startups, into building new incubators, technological incubators. We have seen the examples of Silicon Valleys, which have been particularly very successful in the US. We've also seen the examples of science parks, which technology enterprise zones being built, where much more hard sciences will be promoted with less focus on the soft sciences. More currently, we see how the big data has started entering the discussion. So what is big data, especially in the artificial intelligence perspective, is that they're trying to extract maximum value from large texts or large chunks of data. But this data has also been quite valuable in predicting the user's behavior, but also using new analytical techniques. And as we see in different perspectives in social media, particularly as well. It has also raises the questions of the nudge, to which I will come back later. Now, moving to the next slide. So this one gives you much more, a bit of a taste of the history of social innovation. So when we look at the much more 15th century definition of social innovation or its interpretation, we see that it is mostly associated with the religious connotations of innovation. What we can now call a more deviant behavior. In the religious context, you can't innovate. There is very limited chance for innovation. Any new change has to go through certain procedures, go through certain hierarchies. So these cannot be taken place bottom up, to simplify things. Then afterwards, we see between the 17th and 18th century, we see political revolutions going on. We have the example of English Civil War in the 16th century, but also the French Revolution in 1789 around, which became the key changing points of the concept of social innovation. But what we see afterwards is the 19th century definition of social innovation, in which it was seen much more in the context of social reforms. And we see the definition into socialism. So there was this whole friction, the whole dialogue between socialism and capitalism, in which socialism was essentially associated with welfare, while capitalism was much more focused on work. So capitalists, proponents would say that if you go to work, you won't have to, or the state will not have to spend too much on welfare. So it should promote people to go out and do work rather than idling, which will promote welfare, or welfare will promote idealism. Social innovation, at this point, we see becoming having much more negative meanings. And we see that one of those definitions is that it was increasingly seen as a conspiracy or as a revolution, especially in the context of the French Revolution, that was designed by the socialists or social innovators. So we see at that point that as social innovation being considered as a scheme which is devised by the socialists. So it becomes connected with socialism in some way. Those of you who are old enough like me may recall there was something used to be called encyclopedias. We now know there is Wikipedia. You can just go and type something and you can get the definition, which is much more convenient. But in the olden days, we used to have Encyclopedia Americana, Encyclopedia Britannica, and then there were also in Carta, much more digital encyclopedia. So at some point in time, a few decades ago, there was a lot of reliance on those encyclopedias, which would provide sources of knowledge. And these entries in those encyclopedias were written by scholars who were quite authentic, and they went through peer review. So whatever you read in those encyclopedias was reliable and based on that current thinking. So why I'm giving this description of encyclopedias to help you understand why I'm talking about this, the quotes, which says that communism is the name given to the scheme of social innovation, which have for their starting point the attempted overthrow of the institution of private property. So here we see this reincarnation of this 1858 definition of social innovation. And also, again, if we go further back in the 19th century, social reforms, meaning that social innovation was essentially seeing much more of socialist or communist conspiracy against the institution of private property or capitalism. Even in its today's meaning, it is still often can be seen, or maybe we can see from its historical context, that it was seen disruptive, it was often seen illegal, it was often informal, and also essentially unconstitutional, but also unconventional. So we see all kinds of negative connotations emerging historically in social innovation. And in moving to the next slide, we will discover that how social innovation since the 70s has transformed, has changed. In different way, we can't essentially say that every change has been positive, but there has been different changes. And here, I will take you through some of those changes. First of all, it was to be seen as a guiding principle for social economy, grassroots, and social movements. Particularly in the 60s, there were labor movements, there were student movements, protests going on, especially in Europe, but also around the world. We also witnessed the rise of the third sector, or the social economy, one of those meanings, to reduce the unemployment. So the third sector came at the forefront somewhere in between the states and also the corporate sector, the private sector. So third sector came to the rescue to address the challenges of unemployment. So many of the charities, they emerged, many of the whole idea of cooperatives emerged at that point. Many of the social enterprises started emerging. The concept of microcredit emerged at that point. Microfinance also emerged, and one of the earliest examples of microfinance is the Irish loan funds in the 18th century, which essentially came up as a response to the rigidity of the banking system. The banks were refusing to give loans to the poor people because there was no confirmation, or it was impossible for them to provide any guarantee that they will be able to return it. So what happened was that the Irish loan funds gave the idea of providing cheaper loans at much easier terms. Over the time, then banking adopted to those strategies, and Irish loan funds gradually disappeared. Then we also have seen more recently the P2P, the person-to-person lending going on. So there are many other mechanisms in that sense. We also see much more social innovation as emerging as an ethical side of the corporate social responsibility. So in the 2000s, we see CSI, or corporate social innovation, gradually replacing some of the CSR objectives. So the whole image, the idea that the business does not always have this social responsibility, but also social innovation responsibilities or objectives as well. So how new ideas, new products, new services by any corporate entity have essentially social obligation or social benefits for the society and the community. We also see social innovations emerging in much more physical spaces, which we can call offline, using the current approaches. and increasingly into digital and virtual spaces and social networks and sites using the internet and all the resources. We also see the whole literature on digital social innovation, which is coming, it's also shaping many of the new ideas in the sharing economy, how people share using online resources. If I have something extra, I can share with my neighbors or within the community. So for example, if I have an iron which I'm not using now, so my neighbor could borrow it from me. So how this sharing economy emerges. I can charge for it. I may not necessarily charge for it. But also the whole concept of gig economy has also emerged as a result, which is essentially based on exploiting the human resources without giving people any support which you would get from a permanent job. We also see that social innovation has been adopted to confront social problems due to the state retrenchment. So rolling back of states, the state taking steps away from its many of the welfare responsibilities has also meant that many of these third sector enterprises or individuals or communities had to take steps to provide a replacement for the well-being of the communities. Now we move on to the next slide, which gives the other side of, so we see all the positives of the social innovation, but how about the other side of social innovation? So we see that while social innovation has been used to helping austerity, addressing the challenges of austerity, especially though again in 2007, 2008, the world faced this financial crisis. Many of the banks they became bankrupt. Many people lost their savings. What happened was that the states had to intervene, but the cost of this intervention was huge, which meant that many of the states, many of the national governments had to introduce austerity measures, the cost-cutting measures, which also meant that there were less social services available to the communities. So we can say that whilst helping austerity measures, which the governments made use of to minimize, they also used the adverse impact of adverse social impacts. We also see that it has helped policymakers to use these slogans of to do more with less and to do it better. And this is the definition of social innovation, or the objective of social innovation, which was given by BEPA, which is short for Bureau of European Policy Advisors, in their report in 2014. We also see that there's a move from the corporate social innovation in much more contemporary way. We see that there's increasing focus on ESG now, environmental, social, and governance aspects. And again, the objective is that we want to achieve the greater good for the communities. But this also still remains a questionable argument. To what extent the ESG is focused on the investor side, or the stakeholder side, or the community side, that still remains to be seen. We also see this social innovation being used as into what we can call a state corporate system, in which public-private partnerships became much more prominent. They became a major tool, which were one of the downsides of those PPPs, especially in the UK, was they were protected by the commercial confidentiality. So whilst a public enterprise is responsible, is answerable to the communities, but a private enterprise is not essentially, or it's not really responsible to reveal its secrets or its confidential agreements. So what happened was that there was a lot of PPPs going on in the property rights, in the civil law. One of the examples is the private finance initiatives in the UK, which meant that many of the local authorities or the councils, they entered into agreements with private companies, asking them to invest in the infrastructure, for example, building schools, building hospitals, making use of the new facilities for youth. But what happened was that some of those PFIs were quite successful. On the other hand, others were not much successful, because the public enterprises or the public side of this PPP, they entered into agreement as much more inexperienced, which meant that they entered into the agreement based on some of the terms which were not really beneficial to them. And in the longer term, many of these local authorities, they ended up losing money, losing those services, and suffering a lot of loss. Social innovation also has been used as a policy instrument of Jamie Peck and Nick Theodore, called caring neoliberalism. So there was this, again, focus on strengthening the social policies while also fortifying this entrepreneurial spirit, what we see in the White House's Center for Social Innovation, that how this focus on investment in new entrepreneurial adventures could actually ended up turning neoliberalism as a very caring form in which they are supporting the communities to start up new businesses, new ideas, new concepts. We also see social innovation being used in the context of a retrenched welfare state, where civil society organizations had to step in, they had to step forward to become main providers of social services. And this was because they could provide lower costs. The state could not afford to invest or intervene in those social services. And as a result, many of the civil society organizations based on philanthropy, they had to step in. Food banks, I'm not sure how food banks work in the Brazilian context, but in the UK, food banks are they are not independent. They are independent in the sense that they are working they are funded by philanthropists, but food banks only provide food to those people who need on the recommendation of the local authorities. So in that sense, public authorities or local authorities, they became the mediators who can filter out the right people or people who deserve support, and only they can issue vouchers to people, and these people can take those vouchers to those food banks, and those food banks could provide them whatever they need. But we also see, especially in during the COVID-19, that states still remain or emerge as a major player of providing social services, because many of these community support organizations, the NGOs, or the civil society organizations, they could not mobilize themselves. People were restricted into their home spaces or limited spaces. So their impact could only be very local, maybe at a street level in many cases. So still, which gives evidence that the state has its role and it has to intervene, and it should continue playing its role. Now we'll move to the next slide, which introduces, so next few slides, I will give you some of the definitions in the literature and where it's come from and what are their implications. In the meantime, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer any questions, or at the end of the lecture, we can also discuss any questions if you have, or if there's any point which is not clear. So I categorize the definitions of social innovation into different themes. So first of all, what I call a generalized view, a very, very general, very ambiguous view, which is quite is relative to the challenges of this time. So we see, for example, by Chambon et al., they address the labor movements, especially in France. They've explored, and they try to interpret how these were these initial shape of social innovation in terms of the practices that were directly aimed at allowing individuals, but also groups of individuals, to deal with social needs that could not be satisfied by other means. For example, the state did not or refused to provide those supports. So what happened, that many of these social movements started forming a social, particularly in a very loosely organized way. So they were not very well organized, but still they were in the form of very sustained campaigns to support or to build social capital or address social goals. And even now we see many of the social movements going on in many parts of the world, also globally, for example, stopping the use of fossil fuels, exploration of fossil fuels, extraction of fossil fuels. There are many movements going on. So these are these loosely organized movements which have a specific purpose. The second definition is much more specific and in the sense of the corporate or the business sector. And here we see it comes from the Stanford Social Innovation research that it is a novel solution to a social problem that is more effective, more efficient, but also sustainable or just than the existing solutions, and for which the value created accrues primarily to society as a whole rather than the private individuals. So this definition of social innovation looks at the larger benefit of product or a service to the society rather than individuals. And here we see different examples. We can see renewed interest in fintechs, so how this new technology can improve the lives of people through effective, efficient financial services. We also see a huge focus on ethical finance. So there are examples of CDFI, FIs like credit unions, which are again much more focused on providing membership-based investment and supporting businesses. And also more recently, community finance initiatives. So these are much more based on supporting micro enterprises or micro entrepreneurs who will not be supported by any other institutionalized means. And one of the reasons for these, the success of these community finance initiatives, is that there are also this whole regret among many of the investors that if they go through the banking system, they lose or they have to pay, they have to incur a lot of loss or expenditure in terms of the paying in the interest rates. So many of the community finance initiatives, they work on zero interest or no interest basis, and there are many examples. The third definition is a bit complex, which refers to the more significant, creative, and sustainable shift. So this is a bit abstract definition, but it also helps us understand how the society deals with profound and previously intractable problems. So, for example, poverty. So there has been many United Nations initiatives, Millennium Development Goals, Sustainable Development Goals, but still there is a huge concern that even the SDGs, they have not been able to fulfill their targets as of now in terms of reducing poverty. Again, then the experience of the pandemic is there. Then also we see the environmental degradation is one of those challenges. And here the authors, they identify 3 different characteristics of social innovation or its applications or its implications. So one of the scale. So what is the how many people are affected or need help? What is the scope, for example, extent or opportunity or the possibility to deal with any challenge, and also the resonance, the quality, the depth of these, the prolongation of the challenges. This is where when they call social innovation can intervene. Moving on to the next slide, we can look at much more social policy interventions, more social policy views. Here we can call these much more instrumentalist views, because the focus is much more on this value of the scientific context and theories, how we can determine them. And we can see that in this definition of BEPA, which I mentioned earlier, the Bureau of European Policy Advisors, they define social innovation as new ideas, and these ideas could be products, services, or new models that simultaneously meet social needs more effectively than the alternatives and create new social relationships or collaborations. So here we see a new definition in which these new concepts, new ideas, new services, or new products, they are addressing some of the needs of the communities, but also they are creating new relationships. So to be a social innovation, to qualify as a social innovation, there has to be some social relationship being established. And here we see 3 examples, these 3 different scales, which I have mentioned. First of all is the grassroots example. What do we mean by that? That these are the responses to the mostly unfulfilled social needs of communities, particularly the vulnerable communities. These could be elderly people, this could be children, this could be minority groups or women in different societies. So how these grassroots, these bottom-up innovations can help address those social needs. Then there are innovations that address more societal challenges. So these societal challenges can be bigger across at the national level, but they could be across the borders. And we see the examples of Red Cross, which exists in different countries in different forms and shapes, and how it contributes to providing benefits to the society as a whole. A third aspects is the more of a systemic change aspect of the innovation. So those innovations that can bring more fundamental and systemic changes. And these changes are in attributes and values and strategies and policies, but also they can change organizational structures and processes, but also how the systems, how the services and products are delivered. And one of the examples is the whole approach to the adapting to the climate change. So the understanding that whatever is happening in terms of the climate, in many aspects, it is beyond recovery. Many of the things, for example, floodings, heat waves, which are happening, there is no way to find a temporary solution. The best way is to adapt to this change. So we need to change our lifestyles. We need to improve our urban infrastructure. We need to change our ways of doing business in order to adapt ourselves, our everyday lifestyles to the changing climate. There is a risk, however, that it becomes in these, when we try to embed social innovation in these contexts, it tends to become a neoliberal tool for much more social engineering or political engineering, in which this incentivization, behavioral change becomes the norm. And here the example of Thaler and Sunstein is very interesting, when they define nudge as an idea in which you can bring about a small change without people realizing much or without people objecting. But main idea of nudge theory is that the changes which are introduced, they may not necessarily be beneficial for the communities. For example, if people are not paying their parking charges, they're not paying their council tax, so the councils can use different ways of pushing people. For example, in many parts of the UK, some of the local authorities, they hired the nudge group to give them some ideas, and many of the most successful ideas was to start sending text messages warning people that if they didn't pay their charges, their dues, they will be taken to courts and then they will incur more fines. So people started paying those smaller fines early rather than under the influence that they may have to pay much more. Then in the next slide, we move to what we can call more community development view. And this is, I think, these two definitions, I think they are much more comprehensive. First of all, is this social innovation is the creation of new products, new services, or new organizational structures or activities that are better or more effective than the traditional public sector philanthropic or market-reliant approaches in responding to social exclusion. So here we see the social innovation becomes much more concerned about the social inclusion, bringing in people together, rather than just improving on the social benefits. And here, again, this could be any form of innovation, which is much more better, much more effective. And so there is this concept of learning from mistakes. The second definition is social innovation is path dependent. So the path dependence refers to the idea that the communities or institutions, they may respond to different challenges, different crises, based on their own past knowledge, their past experiences, the past trajectories, or the past decisions which were made, and how they learned from those. So in that respect, we see social innovation much more as a path dependent, as an embedded trait in a community or in an institution. It also refers to those changes in the agendas, in the agency, and in these institutions that lead to a better inclusion of the excluded groups and individuals into different spheres of society and at different spatial scales. So here we see social innovation becoming a multi-scalar definition or concept. We move on to the next slide. And for the next 3 slides, I will introduce you some of the publications and what comes out of those publications. What we learn, what we get in essence from those publications. So first of all, there is this the International Handbook of Social Innovation, which we published about 10 years ago in 2013. The focus was much more on the concept of social or collective action, social learning, and transdisciplinarity. What's the role of the knowledge and practice? And here we identify there are 3 dimensions or 3 conditions of social innovation. So I very much like to emphasize that we cannot label anything as social innovation until and unless it satisfies these 3 criteria. So for me, these are the major key criteria of social innovation. First of all is the satisfaction of basic needs, and these needs could be individual or collective, preferably collective. So, and how the satisfaction of fundamental social, economic, and also environmental needs, for example, sustainable development, climate change, can be addressed. So any socially innovative initiative should be addressing the needs of the communities or of the groups in a society. The second dimension or second condition is the strengthening or reconfiguration of social relations. So we also already saw in some of the definitions before that social innovations are those which improve social relations between the communities. And here we can see there's a lot to learn from Durkheim and from Marshall Salien's work on reciprocity, solidarity, and redistribution of resources among the communities within the communities. Then the third condition is the socio-political transformation and empowerment. So what do we mean by that? It refers to the inclusion of communities. It refers to participation, but also association within the societal structures and institutions. So to qualify as social innovation, any new idea, new practice should satisfy the basic local needs. It should strengthen social relation, but also provide opportunity for democratic transformation and empowerment. In the next slide, this is based on a research paper which we did for the European Commission. It talks about if we move to the next slide, please. So it refers to the role of research, the role of academia and research. So we were asked to do a survey of last 20 to 30 years of research, which was funded by the European Commission, and what impact it had and what was the way forward. So what we discussed in that report was there's strong the research which was conducted under the auspices of European Commission. It strongly focused on collective action. It has huge impacts for policy making, but also again supporting socio-political transformation, and also provided a new policy landscape. So the idea was to reevaluate the role of research in social innovation and how it has contributed or can potentially contribute to the future research agenda with a particularly European focus. Then we move on to the next slide, and this slide shows a recent publication by 4 of key authors, and especially with Marxist economists or economic geographers, and they have tried to address the third condition of social innovation, the democratic empowerment. And here we see they are talking about how social innovation can introduce political change. And we see how they provide a review, an overview of modern democracies, and how in many cases, many of the democracies were failing as welfare states. They were failing to provide the welfare support to their communities, which was supposed to be their primary agenda. And they have argued, they have given different examples. One of the conclusions is that there is a need for much more progressive socio-political agendas, there need for much more progressive strategies, and also social movements to overcome these failures. So their justification is that the contemporary governance mechanism, they are too slow. So you cannot wait, the communities cannot wait that long to go through all those bureaucratic processes to get a response or to get then what they need to satisfy their needs. So there is a need for much more stronger forward-looking agenda. They also refer to what they call bottom-linked governance for socio-political transformation. What do we mean by bottom linking? Is that the recognition that top-down initiatives without any bottom-up support are bound to fail because they are not addressing the needs of the people. They have not really addressed, they have not gone through the processes in trying to understand what people were looking for. But also, on the other hand, bottom-up initiatives cannot be guaranteed to be successful unless they have some kind of top-down support. So unless there is the local mayor or local authority or some national or provincial support, state level support is there, it is very difficult to have a sustained bottom-up initiative. So what they are looking for is somewhere in between the top-down policies and the bottom-up initiatives to find a way where there's a bottom linking initiatives where there's a communication between the communities and the policymakers, between the practitioners, and then trying to understand what are the basic social needs and providing much more democratic engagement and improving the social relations. They also make recommendations for much more self-emancipation driven political mobilization. So we can see how they are concerned with the failure of the many democracies around the world and how strongly they feel that there's a need for political mobilization and much more political engagement, and what role can institutions play in this thing. So it's a very interesting read in that sense, a much more recent work. If you move on to the next slide here, I tried to put together some discourses and some alternatives. So there's a lot of literature, a lot of research being published in social innovation and on social innovation, a lot of conceptualization and reconceptualization going on. So we have to be very careful what we read. With so much information around, even I just very recently I had an experience of my own PhD student who was giving me some examples of some of the very recent papers on social innovation. Some, for example, saying that the social innovation emerged from the Second World War. The others said that, oh, it emerged only in 1990s. There was no social innovation before. But since I have already introduced you through the earlier slides, that many of these works, they fail, or many of the academics, many of the researchers, they fail to understand or fail to maybe look at the historical context of social innovation. Where was it coming from? There's a lot of published literature. Whatever I have mentioned earlier, it has all been published by many scholars. It is readily accessible, and it is also listed in the references. If you find it useful, you do have a look. So here I've tried to synthesize some of the debates in social innovation. And just a message to Professor Pauli that if you feel like I should finish, just let me know and I will try to wrap things up. Otherwise, I may go on. So here I have looked at.
It's okay.
Okay, thank you.
You can go forward.
Okay, thank you. So here I try to define. So these are my own understandings. It may be that these authors may be thinking otherwise. So it's my own reflection of what are the key discourses in social innovation currently. So one of the key discourses is the replicability. There's a common idea that you can replicate one successful initiatives from one community or from one country to other countries if you follow certain steps. So you can, there's a given hierarchy of steps from steps 1 to 10. If you follow those steps, you can innovate. You can become a social innovator. You can have a socially innovative bottom-up initiatives. One of the examples was of this big society in the UK, which was promoted as the state asking communities to introduce new ideas, do things on their own. They are against the big government. The idea was to give society more powers. But the problem was that the society was promised, the communities were promised powers. They were not really granted or given power. They were not given resources. So not every society, not every community has the right set of resources. They need capacity building, they need training, they need experience, they need support. So the big society did fail in that sense and disappeared. The second discourse is on durability, how much more the longevity of socially innovative initiatives, social innovations in social and economic imperatives of growth. So the focus here is much more on growth and policy. So doing more with less and doing at a lower cost. The third is much more, we can relate it to the concept of resistance, that we should introduce, or we should face this whole idea of new social movements, that how we need to make use of new tools and techniques, and be much more diverse in our objectives and use new tactics. For example, social media platforms, use more cultural resistance. So trying to distinguish themselves from the old concept of social movements, in which they were much more organized, institutionalized, focus on using traditional methods of protests. So new social movements finds new ways of doing things, new challenges, and it does so. For example, Just Stop Oil is one of the organizations. Also, Extinction Rebellion is one of those organizations which started in the UK. They've been very, very effective in some ways, but also faced challenges in other ways. In terms of the alternatives or additives, or what could be added, or what could be what could strengthen social innovation, I have given three ideas. One is the adaptation approach by Jean Hillier from Revellino, who again counter this idea of replicability. So they say that instead of imitating, we need more of a transformative social innovation approach. We look at the flows through the experiences. We need to look at the discussions and critiques. So we need to discuss together, much more strategic steering rather than just following or replicating. Another, which we just discussed in the previous slides, is this whole bottom-led governance. So we were talking about bottom linking, connecting the top-down with the bottom-up, and trying to find ways in which state institutions or the policymakers could collaborate with the communities. And Mullard, Maganelli, and Peter van den Broek, they have come up with many of the community-based actions, initiatives from around the world. They've given examples of social, political, ecological debates, discussions, successful movements, and how these have actually provided some very interesting examples of that bottom-led or bottom-linked governance is possible. The third is much more focused on resilience. So resilience is something which is resurging now, which is again coming back. So it was 10 years ago, it became very popular in the policy debates, especially in terms of the environmental challenges, climate change. But now again, resilience in its current definition is becoming much more wider spread, much more, it can be from personal resilience to psychological resilience, to community resilience, to urban resilience. So the resilience challenge is becoming very prominent. One of the key reasons is that we are facing shocks, we are facing challenges. These challenges could be natural disasters, these could be conflicts, community conflicts, it could be violence. So there are uncertainties which are happening, especially in the cities, but also in the business environment. And the idea of resilience from the social innovation context is to how you can prepare, be much more inclusive, trying to address the needs of the communities, and much more democratic engagement and participation. So moving on, I will just quickly pass through this whole idea of this complacence and dissent. So social innovation, in the next slide, I see there's a whole potential for, there isn't much work done on these two ideas, but I think it is relevant maybe for the people who are attending this talk, that complacence is, or compliance, so compliance is about or following certain given criteria, following the commands, or just addressing or accepting the rules or standards. It can be in terms of listening or accepting the authority. It may still be, with some reluctance, people may still keep following rules, although they feel reluctant. On the other hand, we see social innovation potentially as a disruptive force. It can disrupt the status quo. It can disrupt what people are not happy about. For example, if there are no social services provided to the communities, what can communities do? Communities need to engage with the policymakers, so use bottom-led governance approach. So we see there's a paper I worked with Professor Terry Marsden previously, in which we try to look at some of the social norms ideas and see how they can improve more longer-term effects in a society. There's also very interesting work by Professor Len Arthur. He wrote a paper, it's an unpublished paper in 2009, and he introduced the concept of deviant mainstreaming. And he defines it as something that encapsulates a range of processes that celebrates the potential challenge of resisting and being deviant, whilst at the same time recognizes that if it is not possible, so if it is not possible to introduce a change, to be deviant, diachronically, to completely challenge the social context, then it is important to recognize that the challenge can be kept going synchronically through social movements such as cooperative. So he has a huge huge body of published work on cooperative movement, and he thinks that if it is not possible to be disruptive, at least it is possible to take a step forward to focus on the key agendas and support those new key agendas through social movements, for example. So we will move on to the next slide, but I think I will skip this slide. It is very self-explanatory. It looks at some of the research which came out of the previously mentioned policy paper. And these are some of the European Commission's funded projects which set the agenda for social innovation research in its contemporary form. So you can always look at it, catch up later. We will move on to the next slide, and here it gives much more contemporary definition of social innovation, which is in these. So yeah, so this slide is much more on the European policy. Again, it came up from the previous works as the Social Innovation Europe initiatives also. So it also looks at much more the European definition of social innovation. So we'll move on to the next slide now, which refers to the present day challenge of social innovation. And here I will also I hope to get some inputs from Professor Pauli as well, because my knowledge is about Euro-Canadian. So these are the two. I will first give the context. So Shockley has written a review of one of the books which I mentioned earlier, the International Handbook on Social Innovation, and he very interestingly divided the literature and research in social innovation into two forms. One is Euro-Canadian social economies, so it's diverse. It is quite theoretical. It is rooted in the European ideals of social and solidarity movements, and there's a lot of work in Canada, especially in Quebec, where a lot of research and a lot of interesting ideas have been put there. The other is the Anglo-American entrepreneurship studies, which are a reflection of what I mentioned earlier in terms of this replicability of social innovation. And also what the Anglophonic social innovation literature focuses on much more business innovation and organizational sciences, the management sciences. So again, the idea is to focus on the crises, the situations of crises. We've lost the slides.
So Abid, I don't know exactly what happened, but you can, if you want to finish it, it's no problem. But
okay,
just
so I will
it's
just
really.
Yeah, I will summarize in a few words now that, I will just try to summarize based on whatever I have discussed. So there are three core principles of social innovation, which I would like to just put together for you. First is that the social innovation is not reducible to a field of knowledge or one single field of endeavor. It's much more transformative. It does not restrict itself to a particular sector or to a particular economy. It is a way of understanding a wide range of activities and practices which are oriented to addressing social problems or meeting human needs. The second characteristics is that social innovation does not separate means from ends. So it treats needs and problems as inherent in social relations, and it also involves changing relations through the adoption of new social practices, new institutional arrangements, new forms of engagement and participation. And finally, the final takeaway for me from this talk is that the effects of social innovation, they extend beyond the immediate meeting of needs. So we have been talking about addressing social needs, community needs. Social innovations, they can improve long-term opportunities, not only for the individuals, but also for the communities. They can also produce more efficient, more effective, and much more sustainable means for society to deal with its challenges. So this is all. I had some examples, but I'm not sure if the time allows.
Yes, you have, Abid. You can go forward.
Okay, so I will thanks. So I will just go through. I'm not sure if it's possible to move the slides, but I will give 3 examples of social innovation. One is the example. So if we can, so these are different types of social innovation. This slide shows some weak and strong social innovation. You can look at the literature. There is also this question of technocratic versus democratic social innovation. There's also discussion on instrumentalist versus radical social innovation. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So I've covered this summary, and the next slide after that. Yes, so this is just quickly an approach to regenerative development. So what is happening here is that I've tried to look at the this figure is proposed by the World Futures Council, and they applied this concept in planning for Adelaide City in Australia. And the idea is that we need to go beyond sustainability discussion, this sustainability debates. And this kind of a scale gives you a differentiation between the conventional practices, which we are doing now, to the sustainability, which is kind of a zero somewhere, which should be the base point. And it takes all the way to restorative development, which are reconciliatory development, up to the regenerative developments. And I've also published a paper with Lorena Exente, who did a PhD thesis on this, and published a paper on the potential for regenerative approach to development and governance. And she used the example of the Cardiff City region, Cardiff capital region in Wales. It's probably in the references, so you can look at it. So, and the next slide is the example of a social science research park. So this is this is probably the first social science research park in Cardiff, and the idea again is to provide much more interdisciplinary platform for social science research. So usually we have these science parks in which a lot of new technologies and new innovations take place, but how about need to have a social science research park where new ideas can be shared, and there is transdisciplinary research between the science and the practice, and also policies could take place. So this is one of those platforms which Cardiff University has provided to researchers, much more starting from the Welsh level research, but also much more international as well. And finally, there is example of the well-being of future generations. The next slide, which gives the more of a national level or the state level initiative. So the next slide will show the approach of the Welsh government towards the well-being or the sustainable development goals. So if we could move on to the next slide. Yes. So these are 7 well-being goals defined by the Welsh government. It's a simplified version, we can say, of the 17 SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And what the government did, that they enacted it into a Future Well-being of Future Generations Act. So it's a legal responsibility for all public authorities, public institutions to follow these 7 well-being goals in all their everyday policymaking and implementation initiatives. And what happens that the government annually follows these the performance of all the public institutions against these well-being goals, and it publishes a list of achievement of those well-being goals by different institutions. So it's a good way, it's a nice way of keeping track of which institutions are doing what, or which aspects of the community are improving. And these, you can see, they are about resilience to environmental changes, prosperity, growth, economic growth, health and well-being, more equity and equality, the cultural importance, much more community cohesion, but also global responsibility of a country. So I will end here then. This is the, again, example of the transition movement, which is a global movement taking place. It started in 2006 by a college lecturer who gave an assignment to his students, asking them what would the life be like in 2021 in your town. And the students came up with some ideas, and these ideas became practice. So when Rob Hopkins moved on to other parts of the country, he tried to implement. He built first transition town in Totnes. Now there are many transition towns. You can go on their website and see there are many towns in different parts of the world. In Brazil, there are many transition towns. So it is an interesting reflection of a socially innovative initiative which has become a global phenomenon now. And the next slide is the final slide, the final slide of this. So what is the future there? So the idea is to reintegrate justice, equity, and redistribution into policy for social innovation. So it's not just about rights and opportunity, but also about fair and impartiality and fairness. Again, bottom linking governance, bottom-led governance, on matching policy, social innovation organization, research models. So we need much more integrated policy. There are also, for example, responsiveness of political ideologies, regenerative development. I just gave an example. And most importantly, the relationship between the people and the nature, again, which is reflected in the figure I showed about regenerative development. So I guess I will finish here now. Thanks very much for listening and for being very patient. And thank you to Professor Pauli for being so flexible.
Thank you, Abid, for your brilliant explanation, your lecture here. It is really important. I'm sure that all the people really enjoy. And there are a question here, and so maybe we can speak a bit more, and you can speak a bit more about some issues specifically, if it is possible. And so Julio Rojenhol is a professor from our university here, and he wrote congratulations to Professor Abid for the excellent presentation. And Abid, can you explore the contrast between nudge and social innovation a little further? Are nudges individual initiatives to induce social behavior that are not very transparent and without reciprocity? And at the same time, if you want to speak a bit more about the role of the creativity in this process, I think this is really important. Then, so maybe we have the struggle problems, so many problems that you cannot really do more differences in the innovative and the social innovation, but there are so many things that are possible to change. Yes. And what is the role of the creativity in this process? Yes, okay, it seems something simple to say does, but I think that we have so many challenges we have really in order to promote social innovation. As you told, it is not possible to replicate it, of course, all the initiatives, but I think that it's very important to know what other people are doing in other places. Even you can make changes to start to improve it, but we need to learn very much about what society, what communities are doing in relation to change to promote the necessary change. So it is open for you.
Thank you. Yeah, and thanks for, it's a very interesting question, especially, so I gave the example of nudge as a warning. So what is happening that the idea of nudge became so popular, particularly in the UK. The UK government, when it was led by the Prime Minister David Cameron, they became somehow very interested in the concept of nudge. What nudge implies, essentially, in a more simplistic terms, is that what we call this the bringing in changes, but much more paternalistically. So it's like a soft change in attitudes or behaviors of people. So the idea is comes from much more economic psychology, I think, but the focus was much more how to change people's behavior to the benefit of, for example, of the government. So at that point, the government was going through the transition phase in the phase of the financial crisis. They were trying to recover. They were trying to find different ways of increasing their income. So what better way to increase your income, also increase the income of all the state institutions or the local authorities by finding new ways of doing things. And they found nudge as a very interesting example. So there's a whole nudge unit in London, and they've been very successful in providing these tools and techniques to different internationally also, in providing tools and techniques to help, for example, make more money for the institutions, or to find different ways of getting people to comply with the needs. So not all nudge initiatives have been effective or efficient, but nudge is essentially, as I mentioned earlier, is not necessarily meant to benefit the person who's being nudged. It can be, ideally, it should be for the benefit of people, and this is where it is different from social innovation. The idea of social innovation is democratic participation, social inclusion, and addressing the needs of the communities. On the other hand, nudge has been used as a tool for example, a tool for which sounds like incentivization, but is much more focused on was a neoliberalist discourse, sign of a caring neoliberalism, if we can call it, to get people, to make people comply with the policies of the government. So I gave the example of, for example, charging people money. So irrespective of whether people could be able to afford it or not, they were made to pay their dues instead of the government providing any facilities to help them. The idea was to get more and more out of the people quickly. So that was my only example in terms of the nudge implications, or the idea of the caring neoliberalism. Thaler and Sunstein's work is quite interesting. It's worth a read. Quite interesting in that sense, and also the nudge unit's performance is also very well. If you like, I can send you some references, some interesting readings on that as well. Coming back to the idea of creativity, I think it's a bit challenging, because this whole idea of creativity or creative cities or creative economies, they has been used a lot, slightly beyond the scope of social innovation, because innovation, as I mentioned earlier, is not creation, it's not bringing in something new. Innovation is about changing the settled norm, the settled behavior. So in that sense, social innovation is trying to alter the status quo, and trying to bring in change which is beneficial for the society and which is beneficial for the community, both in the short term and the long term, as we saw in the different definitions. In terms of examples, I have given some of the examples. I couldn't really stretch much because of the time, but I think the examples of for example, the regenerative development is very important, very interesting. There are many communities who have been working, focusing on much more regenerative approach to development. They say that we don't want to focus on sustainability anymore. We want to become part of the nature. We want to work with the nature. So whatever we do, it should be beneficial in the long term for the communities, for the nature as well. And so nature has a way of giving things back to us. So if we evolve with nature, looking at much more whole systems view. So, for example, local food initiatives going on, reducing fossil fuel consumptions. The idea of transition towns meant relying less on fossil fuels. And they already started focusing in 2006 about this the local resilience. The concept of local resilience was introduced, and also they accepted that in the transition movement that the higher the spatial scale, the slower the response. So how we improve the response, how could we become much more proactive? It can only be through mobilizing the communities, much more social and political mobilization of the communities. So in that sense, there's also a lot of published research which I can also provide reference to if people are looking for it.
Okay, so as I understood, of course, that creativity is more important for inventions, as you told, and maybe not. But I think that in the two cases, maybe this is really important because for doing changes, we need creativity. Even it is not so a big a change, but it is very necessary. So I think that you are not accompanishing all the chat here, but Orlando Martinelli, our colleague here, he wrote, "Congratulations and thank you for your speaking, Professor Abid." And Cibele Vasconcelos de Oliveira, "It's a honor to have Professor Abid on PPGE&D. Thank you for the speaking."
Thank you.
You so we don't have more questions here, and I can really just to say you that it's just a minute. We have now another question here. So Orlando Martinelli, professor from what excellent theories based on methodological individualism are insufficient to deal with objective social innovation. Yes, because and this is social innovation, something that comes really bottom up. Yeah? But as you told, it is important. It's important to have the institutions all helping to really. If you want to speak a bit more, something to final remarks, then we have a moment for that. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Just to quickly, I will just go back to the what I just discussed in terms of this the three tenets of social innovation. First, it's the satisfaction of basic needs. The second is the strengthening of social relations, and the third was this socio-political empowerment, the democratic engagement. That's where I think the Marshall Salin's idea of reciprocity and also Durkheim's the solidarity definitions of Durkheim are quite interesting. So it's all about, when we are talking about social innovation, we are looking at the role of the social actors or individuals as working for the collective well-being or this collective benefit, mutual benefit of the communities. So these are less of focused on how do we do things and much more on what are the key objectives in terms of the, for example, socio-political engagement, empowering the communities, but also creating, for example, there's the difference between creativity in the sense that how communities or individuals become creative or productive or proactive in finding new ways of doing things, political mobilization, for example. So I give the example of new social movement as well. So that's also creativity at its best, finding new ways, new tools and techniques, and making use of it. So hopefully it answers it.
Well, so thank you very much. And we don't have more questions now. For that time, really thank you. And so we will finish now this section. Obrigada para todos os que estão presentes aqui. Nós, então, com isso, vamos finalizar essa apresentação dessa aula magna do PPGE&D, né? E vamos tentar contar com mais conexões com a Cardiff University, e principalmente a partir do professor Abid Mehmood, que hoje, então, nos presenteou com essa bela palestra, que é importante não apenas, né, para uma linha de pesquisa do PPGE&D, mas tem 2 linhas de pesquisa que estão bastante conectadas com esse tema, e tenho certeza que contribuiu um pouco mais para pensar metodologias, conceitos, etc., né, a respeito desse tema importante. Muito obrigada a todos os presentes. Então, finalizamos aqui essa transmissão.